Yeah, there seems to be like a 2-second delay or something, but I guess it's just what it is. Again, when I edit it, I can take out these gaps, but it's fine. It does feel a bit like I'm sending out a signal, and then once I've stopped speaking, like I wait for like 2 seconds to see your reaction.
No, that's terrible. Yeah, I have a lot of video calls from here, and usually that goes fine on Zoom. But I think Zoom handles like bad bandwidth quite well, and still gets over the message in like a sort of like smooth transition. Whenever it's like something else, like I don't know, FaceTime or Google Meet or something, it's much worse.
Okay. But just quickly, is the network even really bad when you're like right next to the router?
I am right now right next to the router.
Yeah, I'm just sitting on the router.
Pretty much.
Okay. Maybe that's the problem. You're blocking all the Wi-Fi with your butt.
I'm too heavy for the Wi-Fi.
Anyway, have you been doing, or how are you? Shouldn't you be finished at some point soon?
Yeah. Good point. I should have originally been finished last October, which would have been the 4-year mark. But partly because of COVID and partly just because I wanted to finish another project that I've been working on. Before the end of my PhD, I got a 6-month extension. So that runs out the end of March. So I'm aiming to finish then. So recently I've been trying to concentrate on writing up a paper, which constitutes the second project of my PhD. So that paper, combined with the one that's out now, should form like the basis of my thesis.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I have one question just about the format of, or not the format, but one question about, so you have this preprint, right, which I think was a conference presentation about the Kalman temporal differences. Yeah,
so I'm not counting that one.
Okay, yeah, because in computer science, they often, I heard, or at least in parts of computer science, I remember one guy saying like, well, we don't really do papers, we just do conference like papers, like, you get that accepted, and that is your presentation. So I was kind of curious but that's you're not a computer scientist, so that doesn't count then.
No, well, I mean, I don't know what counts. So in the UK, you don't officially need a published paper to finish your PhD. There's no like strict requirement for that. These conference papers, I have 2 actually. They sort of count as a paper, but they sort of don't. The nice thing is, I think I've seen that a lot in computational neuroscience, where maybe they have some kind of small conference paper, or maybe for a workshop, or a conference like CCN. And then they work that small conference paper out into an actual journal paper, which is what I'm trying to do for the second project.
So this is basically the second project then?
Yeah, that Kalman temporal differences thing is like the basis for my second project, yeah.
And the extension is from within the PhD program, or is that via Neil? Or
no, from within the PhD program. They allow us all to take 6 months extra.
So it's not just because you were a good boy and already published something; it's just to anyone who gets accepted into the program.
So I think originally when I joined, they actually told us that we all could get a whole year extra, and I kind of backtracked on that a little bit. So I counted on that for a while, and then in my last year, I told some of the people of the building like, oh yeah, I might take that extra year because I'm nowhere near finished. And then I heard that actually you can't get a whole year extra. But if you have a good reason, you can get a half year extra. And I think I wouldn't have wanted to take more than half a year anyway. So half a year is okay. Now though, so I was going to take this extension anyway, even before the pandemic. Now with COVID, it's actually quite hard. I think a lot of people are having this right now, but it's actually quite hard to keep concentrating and keep on going at it. So it's got to be tight even for that half-year extension. I'm going to have to work quite hard in these last months and somehow turn a switch, I think.
Yeah, I mean, but that's kind of that's a good move to say everyone can have a year extra when you ask it to say, "Wow, that was just a joke. Didn't really mean that."
Yeah, it's a bit chaotic because it's a very new PhD program. I'm actually on the very first cohort, and during that first year, they were still setting up the program. A lot of things weren't quite clear yet. The person that said that we could have a whole year extra actually doesn't work at the building anymore. So they were still really figuring stuff out. So I think we should be a bit forgiving of the chaos.
Yeah, and getting 4.5 years is also more than you get in pretty much any other program, right? I mean, often it's 3 years and you're out. Good luck to you.
Yeah, especially in the UK, I think. I think in continental Europe and the United States, it's normal to take a bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the format. I mean, when I started in Berlin, it was very much a clear case of like, you have 3 years, you have to like publish something. And if you do that, if you hand in within 3 years, you can get a 1-year postdoc. But it was very clear, like if you're not finished within 3 years, then either your supervisor pays you or you're unemployed. I mean, or you get a different position, right? But that was very strict there. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's what I like about the thing I'm doing now is that I've, it's set up for 4 years. I have a salary for 4 years.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's so much nicer than like being kicked out after 3 years. But actually, I'm curious. So this is something that I've changed my mind on during my PhD a bit. So I'm curious what you think about that. So when I was doing my like bachelor's and master's, I thought, I really want to finish this quick, and I want to, a PhD can take 3 years, so I'll do it in 3 years, and then I'll do a postdoc and all that kind of stuff. But like now that I'm actually doing my PhD, I'm realizing like I'm actually kind of enjoying it, and I'm really enjoying it, and I don't want to take forever to finish my PhD, but right now I have no problem taking like 4 or 5 years because I feel like it just, I can just do research and I don't have to, do much admin or teaching or anything. I can basically just, it feels like being paid to just do whatever I want to do. So in a way, I feel like if I could do this for 5 years, I probably would, if I get money for it. So I'm just curious whether you changed your mind on that or how you thought about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think I went through a similar process. I think from a pure strategy point of view, if you want to build your career in academia or something, the best thing to do is probably to stick around longer a bit in your PhD, because probably when you're a PhD student, that's the first time you're really doing proper research, and often the first time you're doing research in your particular field. And it's going to take you like 1, probably 2 years to even call yourself somewhat of an expert in that field. And I think a lot of people that I know, including myself, you feel like you've just started getting going in the 3rd year or something like that. So taking 1 more year at the end of your PhD might be very fruitful in terms of actually producing some publishable research. Whereas jumping to the next job, where indeed you also have to do teaching, and maybe other things, it might take a bit longer before you get something out.
I mean, what I also always thought is that when you look at least, I think probably actually most of the postdoc funding, it's often restricted to certain amounts of years after your PhD or something like that. So there might be some funding schemes that say, you can apply to this within 5 years of finishing your PhD. So to me, it always seems like if you just take 1 more year and like get out a really cool paper or just a decent paper, right? Just having that more, I don't know whether anyone's really going to look too closely in terms of how long it actually took you to finish the PhD. I think it's more about like, what can you do? And it seems to me being able to, just taking a year to show that you can do something cool is way better than, finishing 6 months early or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you have the luxury to do so, if there's some money, I would recommend that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is a luxury. Yeah, but I'm in the weird position that I had, as I said, I have a pretty much guaranteed 4-year salary for my PhD, to finish my PhD. But then when the COVID pandemic happened, we very early on started doing this project related to COVID and risk perception. which roughly relates to some stuff that my supervisor did before, and we kind of just jumped into it hoping that maybe we can like help or do something important, like not necessarily important per se, but like, do something to inform the situation and kind of use our expertise, specifically his in terms of content more and mine more in terms of just being able to run online studies very quickly, which we tried to just use that for the good. And so I've been basically working on that now since the beginning of the pandemic. Well, there were some months where I did something else, but I've been working on that for like half a year. So somehow I'm ended up in the position where I, practically speaking, have basically a 3-year PhD and 2 months or something.
But is this going to be part of your PhD, the COVID research, or?
No, it's completely unrelated. I mean, not completely unrelated. It's, it's about, I don't know. I mean, very vaguely, it's psychology, so it's related in that sense. But no, I don't. I mean, many people, I've talked to people about this, and they said, well, wait until you finish your PhD and see. Maybe you have to make this part of your PhD, like if you don't get publications out or something. But right now, I'm so optimistic that I won't need to make this part of my PhD.
But that's a nice scheme, though. 4 years for your actual PhD, because so the program I'm in is more of a 3+1, where in the first year you get to do some courses, you can rotate in some different labs, try out what you want, and then there's 3 years for external research, which, in my experience, has been pretty short. Like, first you think, oh, I have 3 years, and after 1.5 years, you still need to do so much. It kind of like feel like it flew over. Yeah,
I guess especially if you're, as you mentioned, if you're doing something that's slightly different from what you did before. I mean, I guess technically you could say the rotations are for that you can do rotations, so you get started with one project, then you've got a few months on that project on which you do your PhD. But I mean, even so, in my case, like I even did what I'm doing isn't a million miles away from stuff I did before, but it still feels like I spent the first year almost just getting to know the field. And for the first time, like having to just figure out, it seems to me you read a paper very differently if you're a master's student or a bachelor student than if you're a PhD student, just because you have a completely different, the purpose and the reason why you're reading is completely differently. So it feels like to me, I still had to I just spent the first year figuring out what the field is. And I'm not finished with that yet.
No, absolutely. I don't know about you, but I feel like I read fewer papers than I used to, but more thoroughly probably.
Yeah, I think for me it really comes and goes in what's the word? Sometimes I'll have a few months where I'm basically just running my experiment, analyzing the data, and reading fairly little. But then I sometimes have weeks where I, reading full time and scanning lots of papers and reading a few papers fully. So I don't know. On average, it's probably fairly similar, but it's not as consistent as it was before.
Yeah, and I guess my focus has changed from mostly the sort of introduction and discussion when I was a undergrad or master student to mostly the methods and results sections, or just like a quick scan of the figures or whatever later on in my PhD.
Yeah, definitely. Although I had one really weird thing. So when I was when we were doing our masters, I was living with someone who was doing a PhD in some biomedical engineering kind of imaging thing. And she actually said the opposite, which really confused me at the time. And I thought, well, maybe she's a PhD student. I'm not. Maybe I got this wrong. Because she said, yeah, since I'm a PhD student, I mainly read introduction and discussion. And then I had this whole point about no, you have to read the methods and the results. That's right. If you do research, you have to do that part. But she argued against it. But somehow, yeah, I wonder. I mean, I think she got a PhD from UCO. I think she must have done something all right. But that still confuses me how she's an ideas woman. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, but it was in engineering. Engineering sounds like less ideas and more execution. So I don't know. But yeah, I agree with you. But I'm still confused with that one discussion I had with her.
I mean, there are definitely still papers that I read in that way as well. Or maybe just the abstract and discussion or whatever. It depends on the level of detail at which I would want to understand the paper, I guess.
Yeah, for example, I mean, the paper of yours that we're going to talk about later, I haven't read all the small print in the back about exactly how you did the analysis and the simulation. Maybe these kind of papers that are still like vaguely related, but more on the, I mean, not directly related to what I'm doing right now. Yeah, I don't go into all the details.
Yeah, same for me.
Yeah, but then just quickly, or not quickly, take as long as you want. I'm curious about your PhD program because it sounds pretty cool from the outside. But could you, maybe could you, how should I say? Yeah, just kind of give a brief outline of what it was like to do the program. I mean, you already mentioned that you have these rotations at the beginning. I don't know. Let's say maybe there's someone maybe someone's listening is interested about applying for the program.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you a bit what the first year was like and how I ended up in my PhD research afterwards. So yeah, for those listening, I'm at the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre for Neural Circuits and Behavior is the full title. And it's a program that was founded now like 4 years ago. I was on the first cohort. Really sort of the idea is to marry a theoretical neuroscience institute, which already existed, the Gatsby unit, and a systems neuroscience institute, which is brand new, called the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre in one building, with its own PhD program as well, where you get a first year of some training in experimental neuroscience techniques and some courses on theoretical neuroscience, after which you ideally join one of the labs that is hosted in the building. And yeah, the original idea of this program at the outset was that in, I guess, like sort of the field of neuroscience, there's quite a large disparity between people working in theory and people working in experiments. And I think the goal of this program is to make that gap a bit less wide. Now, when I joined, the building had really just been built, and the program had just been conceived. So, this has changed a lot over the years. But when I joined, there wasn't much of a program yet. Our courses consisted of some classes by the PIs that were in the building. There weren't that many yet, and walking along with the already established Gatsby.
So not many means it was like 5 or something, right?
Yeah. So at that moment, I think there was John O'Keefe, the Nobel Prize winner who discovered place cells in the hippocampus. Thiago Branco, he does research about innate behaviors. And then there's Troy Margry and Adam Kampf were already there. Soon after that, also Tom Mercisch-Vogel joined, and Sonja Hofer. But that was when I was already in the building for half a year or so. Yeah, and the complete Gatsby unit, Gatsby Computational Neuroscience unit, they were already in the building. So the non-existent PhD program that I joined consisted of going to a lot of those already existing courses that were given by the Gatsby unit, and a lot of courses given by Adam Kampf, who is an absolutely great guy, explaining us a lot of techniques that are used in experimental neuroscience. So this consisted of learning the basics of electrophysiology, calcium imaging, how does a 2-photon microscope work, and so forth, which was really cool, albeit a bit chaotic.
Had you had any prior experience or training in these like experimental systems neuroscience techniques, or was that new to you? Because if I remember correctly, your master's projects were not on those topics, right?
Yeah, definitely. So all of this experimental neuroscience so the building specializes in rodent systems neuroscience. So in the building, most research happens with rats and mice. And all my prior experience was more in human EEG, human fMRI, etc. So this was all very new for me, and the sort of yeah, it's pretty interesting. The level at which a researcher in rodent neuroscience is tinkering with the measuring apparatus itself is really very different between, for example, fMRI and rodent electrophys. In fMRI, there's usually a radiologist who works there, who understands the machine and who helps you as a researcher to operate that. Whereas rodent electrophysiology labs, they make everything themselves. They twist the tetrodes themselves, and there's a whole sort of very artisan style about it, where everybody does it in their own way.
It sounds pretty. It's weird how it's, even though the goals are often the same, how it's such a different world. I mean, as you mentioned, like if you have fMRI, you ideally understand the thing, but you won't really be tinkering around with the fMRI machine. I think most people in charge of an MRI don't want you to really do anything with it.
Yeah, there's a lot more DIYing going on in a rodent neuroscience lab.
Yeah, is this a matter of cost, or like how much does it cost to build a tetrode? Because MRIs cost millions, so it makes sense that you don't want someone without an experience to just tinker around. But somehow I imagine that these animals things would also cost a fair amount of money, right?
So tetrodes cost almost nothing, and a 2-photon microscope will cost maybe a couple thousand, but that is nothing compared to an fMRI. Machine, which I'm not sure what the cost is, but I would estimate
it's more like EEG.
£1 million. It is more comparable to EEG, yeah.
Yeah, and with fMRI, of course, if you're in a big city, the problem often becomes the place to put it in, right? The room. You need like a specialized room for it that has to be large enough, which, if you're at UCL in the middle of London, that in itself can become a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that is all changing a little bit. So I guess especially the electrophys community has lived with these like homemade tetrodes for decades. But more recently, these labs are moving towards like CMOS scanning probes with maybe 1,000 contacts in the brain, which no lab can make themselves. So these are industry made.
How does that relate to the NeuroPixel stuff? So I've heard of that.
That's what I'm referring to. Yeah, a NeuroPixel.
Oh, that is that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So you have like just a company that builds those and sells them to labs then.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was a European Union grant, but I haven't exactly followed that. But I think maybe NeuroNexus makes them. Don't quote me on. Maybe cut that bit out. I'm not entirely sure who makes the NeuroPixel probes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. But we should also say that you don't actually work with these things, right? I mean, you were trained in them in the first year, but from what I can see, you're not actually doing any electrophysiology anyway, right?
Yeah, that's true. So at the start of my PhD, I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I knew a couple of things that I was interested in. One of them is like motor neuroscience and optimal control. Another one was reinforcement learning, but also perception. So it's really like all over the field of neuroscience. So that's in terms of the subject of study. Then in terms of the methods, I found rodent neuroscience very appealing just because of the actual precision that you can record actual neurons with. And of course, that gets very close to how the brain actually operates. There's an alarm going off. This is very annoying. So that gets very close to sort of the units of actual communication in the brain, especially now with the advent of NeuroPixel probes and the like, which makes us able to actually record all of those neurons at the same time. But when I started trying the actual lab research, I found out two things. One is that I'm not particularly good at very dexterous lab work. And two, probably more importantly, because I'd probably learned that, but I don't enjoy it. I did not enjoy working with the animals, and I did not particularly enjoy the prospect of a lot of my PhD being about this kind of tinkering, denoising the setup, etc.
Yeah, okay, like the tinkering, the figuring out exactly how to get the setup to work. With the animals, what did you not like? Did you not like the whole surgery part, or just the killing animals part, or what exactly did you, or was it more about the whole experimental setup thing?
Yeah, well, I think like, just to be clear, nobody really enjoys killing the animals.
Well,
and I'm not. I'm also not against using animals for research in any way. I use a lot of the data that comes from experimental labs. Our own lab does a lot of rodent research. I just thought I'm probably not the person that should be doing it. What I feel more comfortable with is spending a lot more time on thinking about what the research questions are, doing analysis and this kind of thing, which I was used to from more human cognitive neuroscience before. The amount of time spent on actually gathering the data itself, during which you've just accepted, oh, this is the question that I'm going to answer. Like, and I need to gather these data as well as I can with as little noise as possible. That process is something that I see some colleagues of mine, for example, really enjoy, and if you're good at that, that's like a really nice thing. It's not something that I myself enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that completely. I think that's also maybe. I mean, I never did any of this electrophysiology and animal stuff, but when we did our masters, especially the year at UCL, I think I fell very much in love with the whole literature and the stuff, stuff you can find out with it and the stuff that they did find out with it. So I really considered at least doing some sort of project with this kind of electrophysiology. But I think in hindsight, I would have run up the same problems as you. I don't think I would have had the patience almost just to set up something like so specific for so long. I think I enjoy thinking about like the bigger questions so much that probably good that I didn't get into anything like this.
Yeah, I felt pretty lucky that my program's pretty free in what you want to do. So when the rotation in which I tried the animal work was with Adam Kampf, and when I told him that this is not for me. I love the lab, I love the people, and the questions are interesting, but this is just not for me. He was very encouraging and said like, oh, well, maybe do another few rotations and see what you like.
This actually relates to something I wanted to ask anyway, which is, the general question is maybe like, who do you think this program is for? Or like, what kind of questions should you, let's say you think you want to do this, not this program, but like this kind of program doing electrophysiology or something like that. Like what kind of questions should you ask yourself to figure out whether this is the right thing for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if I look around me at the other SWC PhD students, there's really quite a wide array of people. So I don't think you need to be a rodent electrophysiologist or a rodent neuroscientist to apply. There's people with a whole range of backgrounds have been hired in the past. People who are just engineers or that want to move into neuroscience. There's some psychologists, and there are also there's a guy in the year below me who actually started a rodent electrophys project and did that for about 1.5 years, then decided this is not quite for me because I in his own words, I'm too lazy for the for the rodent experiments. So he moved to a theory project, and that is fine with the supervisor as well. I think sort of the answer to your question lies a little bit in the application process already, where they just asked us to write a short essay, 500-word essay or something, on what we found the most interesting unanswered question in neuroscience.
What did you You don't have to read the essay, but like, what did you?
So I actually wrote about sensory neuroscience at that moment, and this sort of predictive coding hypothesis, or sort of hierarchical predictive coding idea. The idea that instead of sort of vision being a bottom up thing, the visual system has a sort of a top down generative model of what is gonna appear on the retina next. Which is not at all what I moved into for my PhD, but so maybe that's another thing that I have learned during my PhD, is that there are a lot of very interesting questions in neuroscience, and as I already referred to, sort of the reward learning field that I actually went into, but also motor neuroscience and perception, and I think a lot of neuroscientists will find that they find all of those fields quite interesting, and what you should choose for your PhD project, therefore, unless you're really tied to this one particular question already, but I think choosing a PhD project should also involve trying to think of a team that you really like working with, a supervisor that you like, and just creating this environment for yourself where you can thrive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I find really weird about choosing a topic is that I find it really hard to judge from the outside how much you actually will enjoy working inside the topic. I mean, so I had this situation where I started the PhD in Berlin and then quit that after about half a year because I just didn't really like I didn't really believe in what I was studying, and I wasn't entirely sure that what I was studying wasn't like an artifact and like an experimental artifact or something.
So was it for you more the topic than the environment that made you decide to stop that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a complicated thing. I think there were a lot of things going into the decision to quit that. Yeah, it was kind of weird that I think a lot of things that I expected to be a certain way were all a different way. And in hindsight now, I realize some of them were probably good that they were that way. But yeah, it was probably like, at least, yeah, I would say it's probably at least like 70-80% of that decision was purely based on the topic. I mean, there were other things like the methods were cool we were using. So we were using like direct cortical stimulation in people who were having brain tumors removed. And it's a super cool technique with which you can, one of the few techniques that you can actually use to test causality in the brain in humans.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty unique set of subjects that you have.
Yeah, that was like half of the thing I was doing. But I also realized so the thing with this direct cortical stimulation is that, it's super cool. Just like I spent a few weeks in the hospitals and like watching them do operations and with people who are awake during the surgery and everything. Like, it's super interesting to look at. But I realized like I can't, how should we say, most of the work with this kind of thing involved just waiting around for them to actually do the operation. So, you kind of have to hope that you get the right patient, which wasn't really that much of a problem. But for example, I quit before I actually before we actually started collecting data. I was just at the phase where I was just checking out what they were doing, other experiments they were running. But sometimes you'd have a patient, and so surgeries just take ages to do, and you have to, you basically just have to stand around there, and so it's just a lengthy process of, let's say, like you have to be there for at least like 2 hours or something, and it might be that. So with these awake operations, they put them under full anesthesia when they open the skull. But then, and when they remove most of the actual tumor, but then when they get to the edges of the tumor, then they wake up the patient to check whether, they stimulate the surface area to see basically whether that impedes functioning. Because the thing is, you don't actually, when you look at a brain tumor, you can't really tell by looking at it what it is. It really looks exactly like the brain, at least in the cases that I saw. It's surprising. You'd think it looks like, some like dark mass or something, but it looks exactly like the brain. So you need to stimulate the edges to see exactly what you're doing. Anyway,
So is the reason that you have to wait there with the surgeon, is the reason because you want to do the task with them afterwards?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is then that you, so once you've kind of taken out most of the tumor and you're there to the stage where you can start stimulating the brain, the idea is then that, so they wake up the patients and then you do some sort of task with them. And then that, for me, would be the experiment I would have been doing with the patients. And so basically, I mean, yeah, the reason you just have to wait around is so you don't miss the crucial part of when you do the task with them. You don't have to obviously be there for the entire operation of when they like, you know, shave the head or parts of the head and all that kind of stuff. But you kind of have to be there for, yeah, it's going to be at least 2 hours. Anyway, so I saw some of the operations where, you know, you'd go in there, you'd wait for a while, and then the patient, when they woke them up, they'd just be very groggy and very tired and couldn't really function well, because even though you say you wake them up, that doesn't mean that like full cognitive functioning. They're still kind of, you know, they've just been, I mean, I don't know whether you've been under general anesthesia. They've just been taken out of general anesthesia. So that's the state they're in. And you get like 10 minutes or something in that state. So basically, I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is that the main skill almost involved with getting this kind of data is just standing in operating theater and waiting. And I realized if that's kind of, I mean, you have to obviously think about what task you want to give them and that kind of stuff, but it's a lot of standing around and waiting. And I realized if that's half of my PhD, then I'll come out with skills that are useful for one very particular environment and almost nothing else.
So it was kind of a strategic choice there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, here's the thing. Like, if as we say, there were lots of different factors involved, and if like a few of them had been better or different, then maybe I wouldn't have quit it. But the main reason was still that I just didn't like the topic. Yeah. Anyway, what did I want to say? Oh, yeah. So the topic. So the point I wanted to make is that, you know, I quit because of a topic. So then when I applied, but I knew I wanted to do research and do a PhD. So when I then applied for other PhD positions, I really paid attention to the project I was doing, and, you know, really thought carefully about that. And so in the end, I ended up getting rejected from quite a lot of positions. And then I saw the position that I'm doing right now, and I really wasn't sure whether I wanted to do the project. I thought, like, okay, the supervisor seems cool and the methods seem like I'd really learn something there, but I'm not sure that I want to do like social interactions and game theory. It just doesn't, I don't know whether I want to do that. Anyway, you know, now I'm 2 years into the PhD and I really enjoy the topic, and I'm not sure I could have chosen a much better topic. So somehow it's this really weird thing where I thought about it for ages, thought like, oh, I'm almost choosing this despite the topic, and now it ended up being a great topic for me. So the gist of this very long story now is that I have no idea how to like decide what your topic is, like what it's supposed to be. Yeah,
I think that's another thing that is often sort of overlooked. Like when you're deciding for a PhD or probably any job, even outside academia, you're doing decision making with very, very, very limited information. And that's just always going to be the case. So yeah, there's a big chance that you'll start something that will be great, but there's also a chance that it won't be quite what you expected it to be. It's interesting what you say about the patients. Some people in my lab are currently having some getting some data, like single unit data from humans with epilepsy who've had surgery there. But I hadn't heard yet about these very long waits.
But that's a slightly different thing though. So if you have these epilepsy patients, I mean, I don't know exactly what your friends are doing, but that's, I think, usually something that you implant on not a permanent basis, but on the basis of a few weeks, right?
Yeah, that's true.
If you have like an ECOG set, or in your case, single. Whereas for direct cortical stimulation, you have to be there during the operation. So that's basically the big difference between those two.
Yeah, that's very different
in terms of like practicality of doing research. But I mean, so actually, I did learn like one thing though especially the second year of my PhD, when I've been doing this COVID project. because that's a project that has a lot of variables and it's longitudinal. So it's in a way a fairly large data set that's, I'm sure there are research projects that have way more complex data sets, but I've realized like during the analysis of this project that I really don't like this kind of project where you have a lot of freedom in terms of the analysis. I mean, obviously we're careful that we don't, this is like an exploratory study from the get-go. So we're not like pretending that we're looking for spurious correlations there and then make some sort of grand claim out of it. But I realized, for example, there, and this maybe relates fairly closely to what you said about the electrophysiology. Like, I'm just not going to do that anymore in the future. Like longitudinal data with many variables, I hate to do that. I like doing simple experiments where you have to really, think about exactly what. I think I really like theory-driven, creating theories and then testing them with fairly simple experiments.
Is your fear with the COVID data set that in the exploratory analysis you might make some kind of conclusions that you could have avoided if you had some kind of controlled experiment?
No, it's not even that. It's, so we, basically we collected this data like in the first week, I think, of when it was called a pandemic. So we were very aware that we just don't know exactly what's going to be relevant here. And we very intentionally and openly said okay, this is one question we're interested in and where we have a hypothesis, and we're going to collect all this other stuff around it because it might be relevant. We just don't know. So, from the beginning, this was a very exploratory study. But for me, what I just don't like is, my supervisor often uses the analogy of different kinds of research you can do. And one of them, and the COVID study is one of this type, is you kind of go into the woods, you have maybe some unexplored territory. You just go into it and you just see what you find in there. So maybe you go into, I don't know, the Amazon rainforest, and you just see whether you find new species of animals or something like that. And that's one kind of research you can do. And I've just noticed that what I really like is coming up with a theory and then saying this thing, I don't know, this be this kind of species in the Amazon. So then I go and look for it specifically. I've just realized that I really enjoy that kind of process much more than this kind of open exploratory, let's see what we find.
Yeah, there's definitely a kind of elegance about very beautifully designed studies that test a particular model versus another one. And they find sort of some kind of causal manipulation within the experiment that really distinguishes between the two. I know what you mean.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe something that's actually very useful to think about in advance, because this is speaking of something that seemed tragic at the time, but it's really lucky in hindsight, is that I got really close to getting one position where I would have been analyzing large fMRI data sets. And right now I'm really glad I didn't get that position. At the time I was a bit sad about not getting it because it seemed like it would have been cool. And I got really close. But in hindsight, I realized I probably would have just completely fallen apart during that project because that's not the kind of work I'm good at doing. So I dodged a bit of a bullet there. But yeah, anyway, so back to your PhD program. I have one question. So, which is, so why did you actually apply for that? Did you think you wanted to do electrophysiology and you just realized you don't want to do it? Or did you actually already go in saying something like, I want to do more the theoretical analysis or modeling, and then be close to people who collect this kind of data? Or
so I was actually hoping to do both and have, while in the program, discussed a few possibilities for doing some kind of sort of crossover where I'd be doing the theory work supporting my own experiments. And there are some people that do that in the building, but it's pretty hard because so if you are doing theory driven experiments of you're mentioning, for example, usually it starts with the theory and the experiment follows. So and coming up with good theories, coming up with good theories that make testable predictions takes a while. That can take the whole duration of a PhD, for example. Yeah, so that's sort of one thing. secondly, as I said, I didn't particularly enjoy the research, so I quickly sort of changed my tactic and decided to do a mainly theory-driven PhD. But at the moment that I joined my current lab, Neil Burgess's lab at UCL, I still had the possibility open of at some point maybe doing some experiments, but rather in humans, either something with like EEG or fMRI or something like that, or possibly behavioral as well.
I mean, by the way, this is a question I've always had. Is it Burgess or Burgess? Is the emphasis on the first or the second half of the name?
On the first.
Burgess. Okay. I think I always got that wrong then. But yeah, because this is actually another. So how did you end up doing your PhD with him? Because so there's a few interesting kind of points here. The first is, of course, that we both took his module when we did our masters. The second thing that slightly confuses this, though, is that, I mean, he, as you said, does mainly stuff in humans, if I understand it correctly, and is even part of the Sainsbury Wellcome, or is he an external? Like, how exactly does that work?
Yeah, so Neil actually has a rodent part of the lab as well. So his lab is really big. And spans currently 3 different buildings. There's the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at Queen Square, where most of the human cognitive neuroscience happens. And then there's a part of the lab which is in the anatomy building with rodent work. And there are a few postdocs in the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre as well, working on rodent stuff.
But you didn't do a rotation with him, or?
No, I did not. But one thing that appealed to me about his lab was this very fact that his work is pretty translational between these different systems. There are people who are just doing like pure theory work. There are some people that do, for example, I just mentioned this study in human epilepsy patients that is led by Dan Bush, a senior postdoc in the lab, who is mainly a theorist but does experimental work with humans as well. Then there's also the rodent stuff, and looking at sort of these same questions that our lab is interested in, which is in the domain of like memory, representations of space, etc. Looking at those same things and trying to find those same representations in humans and rodents is pretty interesting, I think. For example, in the sort of medial temporal lobe in rodents, you find these place cells and grid cells, etc. And there's been some fMRI work seen in humans where in our lab where you can see evidence of these grid cells in fMRI as well.
Yeah. Is it then like on a like kind of day-to-day or maybe weekly basis? Is there like a lot of that exchange between the people in his lab? Or is that more like a theoretical thing where you actually mainly talk to the people who do the theory, and then like once a month or something you see someone who does electrophysiology, or how does that work in practice? Yeah,
so that is like one thing that I expected to happen more when I joined the lab, I must admit. When I first joined the lab, we didn't actually. I was surprised to find out that we didn't actually have a set lab meeting. So the lab goes out for lunch very often together. So that is sort of like an informal lab meeting, but there's no set lab meeting where there's an agenda and we go through all this kind of stuff. So any kind of crosstalk between the different researchers in the lab happens kind of organically rather than it being set up specifically, unless Neil notices, oh, you're working on this thing and it's actually related to what this other person in the lab works as well, so I'm going to put you guys together. But there was no lab meeting, which I think,
is that an intentional part of his, or like, because like I've rarely, I'm not sure I know of a lab that doesn't have like a centralized lab meeting. Was that like he specifically didn't want that, or?
Well, yeah, I'm not really sure. So we currently do have one twice a week during the pandemic, and I think it has to do with Neil's Neil's supervision style a little bit, where like he's quite laissez-faire. So he will just he gives you a lot of freedom to go whatever path you want to. You check in with him quite often. So and he's often very at the lab himself. He's very present, so he's always there for you to ask him questions. But there's very little him pushing you, like I think other supervisors.
I'd imagine that's kind of standard in a big lab, right? From what I kind of understand, is that if you have as soon as the lab is more than like 10 people or something, then you often get the postdoc supervising the PhD students more on a daily basis.
Yeah, well, and that's definitely how it goes.
My impression of kind of lab sizes.
Yeah.
So who were you working with then mainly, like in the last few years?
So I actually didn't have one of those postdoc supervisors myself, but I have. There are some more senior theory postdocs in the lab that I sort of often bounced my ideas back and forth with, such as Dan Bush himself. Andrei Bichansky is another one, and a recently graduated, more senior PhD student, Talfan Evans, as well.
So I'm wondering, just because both of the one preprint I have here and your paper are both also with Kim Stachenfeld. But she's not even. I mean, she's at DeepMind, right? So how does that exactly work?
Yeah. So
because also I still don't understand how DeepMind really works as a company. Like what the people actually do there who work there. Like it seems they're all doing a lot of research, but it's a company, so I don't know. Okay.
So Kim has been sort of informally supervising me from quite early on in the PhD. I know her through a common friend who used to be in Neil Burgess' lab as well. I told this is Sophie. I told Sophie I was interested in these reinforcement learning theories of hippocampus, and she said, "Oh, you should talk to Kim sometime." So that's when I started regularly chatting to Kim about some ideas and my project. And at some point, she said, "Oh, would you be in the market for a bit more supervision on the RL side of things, the reinforcement learning side of things of your project?" At that moment, I was quite at the beginning of my PhD, so I was quite grateful for that. And yeah, ever since we've had this really nice collaboration going on where I bounced back and forth my ideas every 2 weeks or so, and we've written both of these papers together actually.
It sounds pretty cool. I mean, also, just because of the stuff she did previously, especially the Nature Neuroscience paper, it must be pretty cool to kind of have her look over your shoulder, make sure you you do the right thing.
Yeah, so she's great. Kim is great. She's really very smart, and on top of that, also really very friendly and approachable. So it's been really nice for me to have someone like that. And I think if I hadn't started talking to Kim at the start of my PhD, I would have probably sought out a little bit more formal supervision from one of those postdocs in the lab. But yeah, from really early on in my PhD, Kim really filled in that role. So between Kim and Neil, I've had really all the supervision that I needed.
Sounds pretty good. I have one last question about the PhD program, kind of not specifically to the paper, which is just a more general question. Is there anything that you, how should we say, wish you would have done differently during your PhD? Or for anyone who's starting your PhD, some sort of advice? I mean, some errors I guess you have to make yourself, but I'm sure there are some things, or maybe there are some things where you go I don't know, do or don't do X or Y.
Yeah. So I think one of my common pitfalls, and I would love to say that I've already learned from that and I never do it again, but I still do it, is that if I do not understand something, I have a sort of reluctance to seek out help, and I think I should be able to understand this, so I should be able to work this particular problem that I'm supposed to work out by myself, and then I go on that solo for what feels like a while, but then at some point you look on your calendar and you've been working on it for like 6 weeks straight and you've just wasted them on nothing. And that's I think can be a very good thing sometimes, but you should not do that too much, because it's really fine to ask for help, and it can really speed up your project sometimes.
Yeah, I find that a really difficult trade-off to make there, because the whole thing about doing research is often figuring stuff out on your own and doing something that, or if you want to do something that no one has done before, you kind of need to be the person who figures out how to solve the problem. So it's kind of, in a way that's necessary, but I also, and that, sometimes also, like I've kind of in some sense reinvented the wheel once or twice in my PhD, and in a way you could say like, well, that's kind of a waste of time, but I did feel like it was really useful to have done that. So, but then as you say, like you can also just waste huge amounts of time by just running against the wall repeatedly.
I think it really depends on your personality, I guess. Like, so the advice I just gave was probably more an advice for myself than for anybody else. But like, so if you're naturally someone who is prone to going for something, or like is not so prone to asking questions, like myself, then this is a pitfall to look out for. On the other hand, if you're very prone to always asking for help and always wanting someone to hold your hand, then you should probably go the other way a little bit, because your supervisor is going to find you very annoying.
Yeah, that's a good clarification there. Yeah, I mean, this is the annoying thing, right?
I have a friend actually who has a student. She's a friend of mine supervised a student remotely for a while, and the guy was a machine learning student in Stanford, but he emailed her with questions like, how do you plot not one but two different lines in MATLAB, on the same axis. So it's sort of the ultimate laziness. So don't be that either. Be somewhere in the middle. That's the criticism of machine learning, right? Though, to just be told what the answer is and then repeat it. So I guess in a way he's taking his machine learning very seriously. But yeah. Don't ask. Just Google it. Someone would have asked that specific question on Stack Overflow like 10 years ago. Yeah. So don't ask Googleable questions, but yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'd like to move slowly towards actually talking about the paper. Maybe so you did your rotations, realized you don't want to do electrophysiology. Somehow you ended up in Neil Burgess's lab and supervised by Kim on a fortnightly basis. So talking about the PNAS paper, how did you kind of, like, what are the beginnings of that paper? I'm assuming it wasn't just, I want to create this model of hippocampal and dorsal striatal learning and decision making, and then you just wrote it. So
this was actually me joining a existing project that was already going on in the lab. It was started by Fabian Kersey, who's my co-first author on the paper, who was a postdoc who left for industry a while before I joined my PhD, and he left an unfinished project basically that Neil said, "Why don't you start working on that? It could be a great introduction to learning some theory." When I started on the project, I was told there was a code base with some code for some of these simulations, but none of the I couldn't actually find any of the code, and Fabian himself was very busy at that moment, so it was pretty difficult to get a hold of him. So yeah, as a first exercise, I kind of like started over. At that moment, there were some ideas about these like striatal model-free controller that is still part of the paper, but the hippocampal controller, which is also part of the paper, was conceived as a allocentric learner, but not necessarily this successor representation model that we currently have. And along the way, I started finding that like a sort of model-based type approach for hippocampus would fit the data better than the original model. So yeah, the way I started with this project was jumping on a project that was already going on and giving my own twist to that. The idea for this successor representation model, which I can explain what it is in a bit if you want, of course came from talking to Kim about this, who has a previous paper where that is introduced. I think you mentioned it already, this Nature Neuroscience paper where she introduces that as a model of hippocampal place self-firing.
So what was the kind of goal, or what were you trying to do then when you, like once you joined the project? Was it to find one model that can combine spatial navigation literature and decision-making literature, or what were you trying to do when you were doing these simulations?
Yeah, so there's a bit of there's these two different fields, the reinforcement learning field and the spatial navigation field, that have some overlap, and they both talk about these different learning strategies. In the reinforcement learning literature, people talk about this model-free versus model-based reinforcement learning, where model-free reinforcement learning or habits are just learning from from the rewards and the mistakes that you got. Just like, I'm going to repeat actions that led to reward in the past, basically. And a model-based planning system builds some kind of model of how these different states in the world relate to each other, and uses that model to simulate the future and tries to get to an optimal policy in that kind of way. Now, that seems to almost directly map onto the different strategies that you see in spatial navigation, or at least like they're often talked about in a similar way, where you can have navigation. So in navigation, they make this distinction between response learning on the one hand and place learning on the other hand, where response learning is defined as remembering an egocentric or a self-centered sequence of turns. For example, like go left at the tree and then right at the church or whatever. Whereas place learning would be viewpoint invariant, like remembering a location on a map or whatever. So regardless of where you're coming from. For example, the treasure is buried at 5 meters east of the church. And now, that seems to map on really nicely, because this cognitive or this map based, or like where if you have an internal representation of a map, that could be a nice ground for the for this model, for model based reinforcement learning, but it doesn't necessarily map on one-to-one, because in principle you could do planning in an egocentric space, for example. So you plan to first go left and then to right and so forth, and that can be done in a very flexible manner. And you could also have a sort of map-based representation of the environment and do model-free reinforcement learning over that map, where you just have a model-free association between this place and a reward. So you just have you think, I'll just go back to this place to get that reward every time, which is this a sort of like inflexible model-free strategy, but applied to an allocentric representation. So the goal of the project is really to set out these different things and see if they map onto each other. in the paper we simulate a bunch of behavioral experiments using this model-based and model-free different controllers, where and we show indeed that having some of these placed learning behaviors. That's sort of I would say if I would summarize the findings of the paper in one sentence, that some of these placed learning behaviors, those allocentric behaviors, are indeed captured only by a model-based strategy, the successor representation, or model-based. We don't really distinguish between those two, but you need to have a non-model free strategy. The animals follow a non-model free strategy when they're doing these placed learning behaviors. So indeed, the egocentric behaviors seem to be quite model free in these tasks that we simulated, and the allocentric behaviors seem to be model based, which conforms to an intuition that many people had, but our paper is really sort of fleshing that out a bit more precisely.
So this is one kind of big question I had about this. So I read the paper and thought okay, this sounds really cool. You have these two separate things that are can be kind of explained by the same thing. But then I did immediately have this kind of, not exactly criticism, but this thought of, well, yeah, but isn't this kind of what everyone has been saying already? Or the immediate example I thought of, and I think you might even be using this in the introduction, I can't remember, but is that reinforcement learning is often explained with an example of spatial navigation. So you use something and say model-based is, you have a map, right? That's the whole thing with the place cells, right? You have a map, and then model-free learning is explained with a habit where you just go left or right if that led to a reward in the past. So one thing that I mean, in a way, it sounds like a very critical question, but it's just I just don't quite understand this. Is that the question I had was, so what exactly are you kind of then adding? If it seems to me, that this analogy between these two things was how I almost learned about them in the first place. So do you see what I mean? To me, it's not entirely clear exactly what the model adds beyond what was already known when we learned it.
Yeah. So, I mean, in principle, a great point. I think a lot of these sort of intuitions were already there. Still, though, an intuition is not quite the same as a computational model, of course. And fleshing out how you would actually do this arbitration mechanism based on reliability is one of the contributions here. But a second contribution, I think, is the fact that you have there seems to be a nice intuitive understanding of a map is sort of a cognitive map is a bit like a model, as in model-based reinforcement learning. Is not quite right because of the point I made earlier, because the map can be seen as sort of the representations that you learn over. Sort of whether you use a map or just learn directly from cues, is sort of representation you start with, and how you then associate that map to reward is another question. So we're really sort of saying there's a difference between your navigation strategy that you choose and the decision-making strategy that you choose. And in the brain, they happen to map onto each other, but computationally, that is not necessarily true.
Sorry, maybe I misunderstood something there.
So it makes a lot of sense that the brain works in that way. It's because to build this sort of map-like representation, you need to have some kind of model of the world. You need to know how different locations relate to each other. But it's perfectly possible that you first build such a model and then you perform some model-free incremental type reinforcement learning over that. But that's not what we see happening in the brain. And we see that indeed, if there is such an allocentric representation that animals use, indeed at that moment, they're also more flexible in their behavior. For example, when the rewards that they work for are devalued, they change their behavior when they're being allocentric, but not when they're being egocentric.
Okay, can you, it seems like maybe I misunderstood something about the paper then. Can you maybe explain, I don't know whether we can just use a metaphor, an example here, or maybe use one of the simulations here. For example, I think the water maze is something I also feel like I didn't quite understand something about. But could you maybe explain, like, with some slightly more concrete example and maybe a bit of an anthropomorphizing of a rat, like how these mechanisms work?
Yeah, so basically, if you, for example, think about, so one of the famous experiments that people use to test this, like map-based learning versus response learning, is a plus-shaped maze where there's 4 arms basically, and animals are trained to, for example, always start in the north arm, to then run to the west arm, to take a right turn to the west arm. And then on probe trials, they put the rat in the opposite arm, and they check whether do you make the same egocentric turn, or do you take the same go to the same allocentric place, so taking a left turn instead of a right turn. And what you see is that animals early on choose this, are in this sort of map-based strategy where they go to the same allocentric place if you give this probe trial early on. But if they are overtrained, so they've really done like lots of trials, they switch to an egocentric strategy. Now that could be, so this is a good moment to make the distinction. That could be explained by any model that, and this is often sort of like referred to in a reinforcement learning way, but it could be explained by any model that uses any sort of so it's basically the place learning strategy doesn't need to be model based. It can be just any model that has an allocentric representation of that environment. They can do model free learning or model based learning over that, would choose that place strategy. And any model that has an egocentric representation, be it model free or model based, would choose the egocentric response strategy. So the fact that you see, for example, that if animals have a hippocampal lesion, they only do the response strategy, and if they have a dorsal striatal lesion, they only do the play strategy. That doesn't yet tell you the learning strategy that they have used to learn about reward there. So in the paper we put right next to that a devaluation study where if you devalue the reward, you see what happens. And now that this is sort of a classic thing in model-based versus model-free learning, that a habitual controller, and that this is conceived as model-free reinforcement learning, will keep on working for a reward even if the animal doesn't like that reward anymore. So in these experiments, the reward, for example, is paired with an illness, or maybe they could just give so much of the reward that they're not hungry anymore or whatever. And animals that are really overtrained, and the theory says, oh, these are model free, they keep on working for that reward even if they don't want the reward anymore. And now what you see is that in this plus maze, this place learning strategy, so the allocentric one, is indeed sensitive to reward learning, but the response learning one is not, showing that it's indeed a more that indeed the allocentric strategy corresponds to a sort of model in the model-based, model-free reinforcement learning kind of sense. And so this is sort of one example that we highlight, but we basically show a series of experiments that point to such a distinction.
Okay, this is, I think, the first time on the podcast that I realized I really misunderstood a paper. Somehow I completely missed some of the points you made.
Oh, all right. Okay.
So this is, I'm not even sure what to do right now because I feel like I just have to read the entire thing again. I think I somehow.
That's probably my fault for writing the paper not clear enough. What is the mismatch between what I said and what you thought?
I mean, so just as a caveat, as I said, like my productivity has plummeted this month in particular. So
yeah,
I read only roughly the first half of the paper. Yeah. So maybe if I'd read like 100% of the paper, then it would have been a bit different. But somehow I thought I think I somehow thought the claim was that basically, that these two things are just the same thing, almost. That if you have model-based reinforcement learning, that is done via place cells in the hippocampus. Almost saying like that this analogy is just a perfect one-to-one mapping almost.
So yeah, we're saying, I don't want to quite say one-to-one mapping, but we're saying in the brain, yes, indeed. The point I was making earlier is that indeed, like we're saying in the brain, these things do seem to map on really well. And there has been some controversy there because the hippocampus, like historically, has been sometimes not found to be involved in this kind of devaluation paradigms, and sometimes it has been. In spatial type tasks, the hippocampus is has always been found to be involved in this kind of like allocentric type navigation. But in a sort of like lever pressing task, where the animal is just in some kind of reward box and needs to press a lever for a reward, if you do this kind of like devaluation tasks, the literature is a little bit hazy on that. More recently, though, there's been some experimental work both in humans and in animals where they've basically shown that in this there's this specific two-step task designed by Nathaniel Doe and colleagues, which is basically a continuous reevaluation paradigm where on every trial the rewards are devalued and you have to are revalued, and on a sort of trial by trial basis you can estimate how model based or how model free you are, and on that task it does indeed seem that the hippocampus is involved in both rodents and humans. But yeah, so yeah, the answer is a little bit complicated.
Okay, yeah, maybe I made it more, seem more clear cut and black and white than you actually wrote in the paper. To be fair, though, I have to say, like as I said, like when I read the part about the Morris water maze, I did somehow, like when I read it, you read something, okay, yeah, I see where this is going, and then somehow it went the opposite way of what I thought you were going to say. So maybe I'm just, maybe I also just think I understand these paradigms better than I actually do.
Yeah, so the Morris water maze task is a purely spatial one here, and in this version of the task, so there's a sort of standard Morris water maze task, which is just about having a animal swim around a circular arena where there's an opaque water in it, and there's some hidden platform somewhere, and they need to find that. In this particular task, the hidden platform was indicated by a local cue that was placed 20 centimeters next to it. So, and then the landmark and platform were moved together, but their relationship was kept constant in every different session. And now the reason for that was that they wanted to tease apart this kind of like cue-based strategy, which they think is sort of, more like egocentric, sort of like go right at the cue, from a sort of place-like strategy where you remember the exact location of that platform relative to maybe like distal cues somewhere. So they're in a more sort of in a more like spatial memory type way. Now,
sorry, just so I know exactly what we're talking about with this kind of task. So the there's no cue there's no cue. So I'm wondering, what does the animal see? Is there any kind of cue outside of the arena that they can see? Or is it literally just they see kind of a, let's say, blank arena, and in the middle there's somewhere there's going to be a cue, and then so other rats?
They have some very distal cues, which are just really far away, which is what the place cell map is anchored to. So you can show this by, for example, rotating all those spatial cues, and the sort of place cell map as you record it rotates with it.
And you always put the rat off from the same point, or is it put in random points in the automaze?
I think it's put at random points. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, random, I think.
Okay.
But of course the edge of the arena itself is kind of a local landmark as well. So there's a sort of edge
but that
of the
looks
arena,
the same everywhere.
It looks the same everywhere, yeah. But if you have the edge of the arena, and
I guess I'm trying to imagine right now, just from a in quotation mark participant's perspective, what it would actually mean to do the task. So I guess I know that there's a platform somewhere that's linked to, there's this landmark, and close to that there will be this platform, and I can go on that, and then I don't have to swim the entire time. But if you change both where the animal is located and where the landmark is, I'm not even sure how.
So a strategy of just swimming towards the landmark and swimming a circle around the landmark, and at the distance of the landmark where you've always found the platform will get you to the platform.
But how don't the animals know every time that they just have to swim
to the landmark? So they learn that by experience. So there's a few things to take away. Of course, in the first trial ever that the animal does that, it has no idea. It's just panicking, and it doesn't particularly like swimming, so it's going to do some random exploration. The first time it then hits the platform, it can do two things. It could, in theory, do two things. It could think oh, well, at this place in my cognitive map, which I've anchored to these very distal cues far away, there's a platform. So next time, I'll just go back to there from wherever I am. Another thing it could do is oh, well, I'm currently 20 centimeters south of the local landmark, so I could use that as a cue. Now, in this particular experiment, for 4 trials long, that landmark was kept there, so it could just swim back there. But then after 4 trials, in the next session, the landmark would be at a different spot, and then the animal has a choice: do I go back to the same place I was before? I can still distinguish that from these distal cues, or do I go to the local landmark? Now, what you see is that most healthy animals actually, in that second session, most healthy animals actually swim back to the same place, and they don't follow the local cue. However, if you keep on doing this, every time 4 trials, it's at the same spot, and then you move it. 4 trials at the same spot, and then you move it, and so forth. Then more and more, that local cue becomes a more reliable indicator of where the landmark is going to be, where the platform is going to be. And you see that animals start following that more.
Yeah, but only if they're healthy. The lesioned ones, it doesn't even really, or it doesn't really matter which trial it is, right? Whether it's trial 1 or trial 4, that's pretty.
So what you see in lesioned animals is that the sort of intra-session learning, that sort of learning that particular place, is almost completely abolished. But across sessions, learning the relationship between the landmark and the platform, that's kept intact. And so over sort of the total of 11 sessions that they do, they actually perform as well as healthy animals, which points to that there is some kind of extra hippocampal controller, or sort of this extra hippocampal system that does this landmark-based navigation. So yeah, that study by Pierce and colleagues was really aimed at sort of trying to tease apart these different paradigms of map-based learning and cue-based learning.
Okay, so can you then again just briefly explain how then the two types of reinforcement learning and the place learning versus response learning, how those then map onto the behavior?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So now in this particular case, there is no direct testing of no very specific testing of model-based versus model-free, not explicitly at least. So there is really just a test of place learning versus response learning. In our model, the model-free system learns through direct associations between a set of egocentric representations of these local landmarks and value. So it's just gonna like action values, which correspond to movement directions. So they're really just gonna move in the direction that was rewarding in the past, based on what the landmark is saying.
But sorry, just one brief question here.
Yeah.
You to me, it would seem as if, so you have these two ways that you can anchor, to which you can anchor the reward, right? One is the distal cues, whatever big thing there is in the room, and the other is the specific landmark in the environment. I'm kind of surprised that, I think you said earlier that the animals initially go for the more distal cues. I'm kind of surprised. I would have imagined that they immediately go for like, well, it's next to that thing that's, right there. So
yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting. It's something you find in general in the spatial navigation literature. So in the other study that we just discussed, in the plus maze, you find that too. The allocentric strategy comes first, and they move to an egocentric strategy only through habit formation, really. Sort of like, oh, it's been the case so often, this is probably not going to change, so I'll just do that. And what you see then as well is that these animals then become inflexible in their behavior as well once they move to this egocentric strategy. How well that translates to humans, I'm not entirely sure. I saw a study presented once by a navigation researcher in humans, and she showed something that like people who grow up in Siena, the Italian city, versus so people who grow up in Siena, which is characterized by a quite narrow little alleys and quite high buildings, they often will be very prone in a similar sort of study to this one, but in VR. They will be very prone to taking a sort of egocentric route learning strategy, whereas people who grow up in American cities, I think they took like, I don't know, Atlanta or something, whatever. They are prone to using this kind of allocentric strategy. So there's some learning involved there, I think. But yeah, animals often first when they're put in this kind of experiment, they prefer a route-based strategy. I think in general, far away distal cues on the horizon, sort of projected at infinity, tend to be constant quite a lot. Like for example, mountains and stuff. Whereas it could be that your local cues are subject to more change. I'm not entirely sure whether that's true.
I see. Okay. So is it almost the case that like if you don't know the environment you're in, you don't even know what variables are changing within it, but the kind of, so, they're not very reliable cues in that sense, but that, large stuff like where the mountains are, that's not going to change. So at least you have something that's very reliable to use. Is that kind of the logic here?
That's my hypothesis. We haven't done any. I want to make it clear that we haven't done any research on that. But, it's something that we observe. We observe that this is true. Animals prefer a place landing strategy when they don't know the environment yet, not that well yet, and they move to an egocentric strategy later on. I could imagine that but this is really just a speculation. I could imagine that in nature, faraway cues are often a bit more reliable because of this sort of like continuity of mountains versus maybe a tree which could be gone the next time you're there because the lumberjack took it away.
Lumberjack just came and chopped down trees in your garden. Although I could imagine for a mouse, it's the tree is probably the distal cue, right? Like the mountains are so far away, they probably don't even see it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm generalizing to like a sort of like general sort of natural foraging setting
to humans,
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think that what I've really learned is that I really need to read this again. I think I need to. Yeah. I think, I also see, I don't know how much of this I'll keep in. I think a lot of the last half an hour was me just not quite understanding the paper.
That's all right.
How useful that is for anyone to listen to.
I'm happy to explain.
We'll see. Maybe I'll keep it in.
To be honest, I didn't actually realize that you had read the paper. I thought you were just going to ask me about it. So that's more preparation already than I expected.
Well, I mean, no. Usually, I actually prepare very. I don't know how much that comes across, but usually I prepare quite a lot for these podcasts. Usually, I actually have read like a few papers by the people and understand them. I think that the main problem here is just that this stuff like reinforcement learning is stuff that I've kind of heard about for quite a while now. So I probably think I understand it better than I do, because I've never actually really like sat down and worked with it and all that kind of stuff. So that might be part of the problem, that I feel like I probably, I think I feel like I understand these things, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I've only, read a few papers that use it, maybe saw an introductory lecture on it or something, and that was like 2 years ago. So, yeah. No, I planned to actually have understood the entire thing, and I kind of the goal is almost that I can ask the questions of the things that I can't get from just reading the paper. Like for example, what your like the stuff that we talked about also a bit in the beginning, like where it came from, why you did certain things. But I guess with this paper, with some of those questions, I'm lacking the basis of actually understanding it.
Well, you can just cut out all of those things where you didn't understand it, and you cut something in, sort of like asking a very critical question, and then you have me mumbling. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I'll edit the entire thing to make you sound like an idiot.
Yeah.
You're actually asking I'll just add questions about something completely else. It's like, so how's life in London? And then you just keep talking about this topic like a maniac. That might be a good strategy. We'll see. Yeah, that's the weird thing. In a sense, I have a lot of power here because I can just edit this in a way to make it seem like whatever I want to make it seem like. There's just a slight caveat that if I do that, I think I'll very quickly run out of guests who want to be on the podcast. So yeah.
It's like Ben's roast.
Yeah, exactly. Me just shitting on people who don't even know it's happening. I'm just trying to get you to talk so I can just get material that I can use against you.
Listen to this idiot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, actually, I have two podcasts. One is the one where I release the actual conversation, and another where I just chop it up. It's like, guys, I found another moron. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask about, which relates to more kind of broader modeling kind of questions, is so one thing that is often used is that you create several different models and you kind of let them compete against each other to see which fits the data best. And I'm just curious, like how you think about that in relationship to this paper, because I mean, in some sense, you have sometimes this using only one strategy, using only other, and then using both of them together. So in some sense, you do have a bit of using multiple models here, but I'm just curious. It seems to me that the overall approach here is still to just present one model and say, this seems to kind of work. Did you like consider adding other models to compare it to, or how did you? Yeah, can you maybe just generally comment on that point?
Yeah, so I think that the point of this paper is kind of sort of a big integrative work where we show that this one thing explains a whole bunch of things in the literature on a very sort of like broad scale. Had I had all the original data sets, I would definitely wanted to do that. But that's not. Yeah, I think like people who take that kind of approach usually have the original data for one data set, and then like analyze it really well and start with a model comparison for a bunch of different models that could explain that particular piece of data. This type of paper is more a sort of like ad hoc trying to make sense of a whole different, for the different parts of literature that were hitherto unrelated. For example, we had this like, the sort of blocking study that was run in our lab, and also this two-step task for model-based, model-free were not designed. Like these tasks, like and those studies were not at that moment designed to be like combined with each other. And the point of this paper is more to sort of theorize and think of how these things could relate to each other. So if like if we were now, for example, to run some kind of experiment, and we were wondering about this model, whether this model could explain our new experiment, plus a whole, whether this model could explain our new experiment, we would definitely do that. We would run this model, fit it to our particular data, and fit a few competing models as well. Is that, do you get what I mean?
Yeah. I think in a way the criticism I kind of have here seems a bit mute, but one general question is like, how do you evaluate whether the model that you have then actually fits or explains the data you have? I mean, again, it seems to me that if you just look at the figures that you've presented from the original data and from your simulations, they look very similar on a like qualitative basis. But like, how do you make that judgment? Like, what if, I don't know, like some of these things aren't quite as clear. Like, how do you still feel confident then in saying that this explains the data? Or was it just saying like, well, look, these are so obviously similar that we're happy just using that as evidence?
Yeah, well, so I think a lot of the data, like, so partly this is born out of a sort of like, we had to do it this way because we don't have access to the original data, because like for a lot of these studies we just don't. But yeah, partly a lot of these experiments were really quite simple with sort of like binary outcome variables. And the points that we were making were more about a general class of model that would learn in a model-based versus model-free, egocentric, allocentric combined, than, for example, making very specific claims about the exact algorithmic implementation of that. For that, I would want to, one, have the original data set, and for a real model comparison, I probably like want to be there at the conception of the study, make the model predictions first, then gather the data, and basically fit all the models on it. But that is definitely, that would be a great thing to do, but it's just not common in this sort of like this type of paper where it's really more meant to like trigger a way of thinking about a set of different experiments that seem unrelated but might be related.
Mm-hmm.
But like that, of course, leaves a lot of work to do in terms of designing future experiments.
I mean, this question in particular is like one that, or also how you just responded to the question is also, I mean, this is something that I find really difficult to understand, like exactly what As I mentioned earlier, like what exactly is the contribution of a paper and what's enough of a contribution. I think, like, for example, with my supervisor, I often have discussions that I think maybe I'm trying to do far too many things at once in a paper or something, where I want to have like like almost like a full-blown theory with several experiments that validated in numerous ways and all this kind of stuff. But like when I, for example, listen to the way you just talked about this, maybe sometimes, there's different kinds of papers, and not every paper has to do all of those things in one go. But I think that's something that I'm still at the very beginning stage of learning.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you want to hear my sort of personal background of that, is that I think I'm very much like you in that regard, that I never think that anything is ready for publishing. So like with this particular paper, I figured we need to do way more and all of that stuff. But my supervisors were like, well, there's already something, so you might as well publish it and then go ahead with your next thing. And with my current project, I'm again in the same situation where I think, I don't know, we've explored like a few things, could do way more. And my supervisors are both pushing me to write up a paper and send it out somewhere. So I think you'll probably have the same in like a few years' time, when your supervisor will just tell you like, this is enough, and you need to send it out and stop like thinking about it.
It is this really weird trade-off because I mean, with me in particular, I did something in the first year of my PhD, which started off as a kind of a first idea, and we also wanted just to see on a practical level how these things work. And then we pretty much had these are 3 experiments, but these are much less effort than doing like electrophysiology or something. It was just 3 behavioral experiments. So we had those done, and they were like minor variations of each other, basically. So we had like 3 experiments done there, and then I basically said like, I'm ready. I felt like, okay, I'm ready to submit this because this is already pretty cool. And then I wrote like a first draft and felt like, okay, there's still something missing here. Like I haven't quite found a good way of framing the whole thing and like showing why it's important. Anyway, then the whole COVID thing happened. We started doing this COVID project, and I basically haven't been working on it since last February in a way directly. And so February of 2020. But then in the meantime, just by thinking about the project occasionally, I had some new ideas. I realized some mistakes I made, some ways in which it could be improved. And so now I'm not at the stage where I have the new version, but like I have so many ways that make this paper so much better. Like it's genuinely fair to say that it's probably like it will be twice as good than if if COVID hadn't happened and we just submitted it last year. So I completely understand the whole, like, don't be a perfectionist, and like, if you have something that's enough, just go with it. But with this paper, I feel like, we would have probably rushed with something that would have been ready and would have been, I mean, the basic idea would have been the same in a way, but it would have been tested a lot less robustly, and I think it would have been a lot less interesting also to read. So it's a really difficult trade-off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when to decide when a project is finished is sometimes pretty arbitrary. Or there's at some point you're going to have to make a cutoff. I with my current project, I could think of like 1,000 ways to make it better. On the other hand, just adding more stuff is not always good. So I'm currently collaborating on this Kalman filter project with Sam Gershman, and he at some point made the point saying like, just adding more simulations or like trying to find more tasks that your model fits to or whatever, that doesn't necessarily make the paper better. Like the paper is good if it's clear and short and concise. And if you can make your point in like short and concise, nice paper, that's probably better than having some other simulations tacked onto it just for the sake of it, you know. And I think he's
having this like thick book of simulations that Jesse made.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, yeah, I think he makes a really valid point. So I'm trying to now, sort of take that to heart and sort of stop doing stuff and just writing, which is sometimes quite hard.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you're in the really great situation that you have, I would imagine, well, just then people also helping you out who have a lot of experience in these kind of things. So I feel like if Neil says like this paper is ready, then there's probably a fair chance that he knows roughly what he's talking about. Same with Sam Gershman.
I currently have 3 people telling me that I should write up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, my supervisor also knows roughly what he's doing. But it's also in some sense we're starting in a field that he hasn't worked in that much either. So I think on that perspective, there's also just about this research area a bit less experience. But I guess it's good to have like 3 people. If they all tell you the same thing, there's maybe a reason why.
Yeah, to be fair, it's sort of Neil is very experienced in sort of fields like spatial memory, or like memory in general, and like spatial navigation or spatial representations, and this kind of stuff. Also, these Hopfield types of models of memory. But reinforcement learning is not necessarily the field of that our lab works in. So I'm like the lab is moving into it now a little bit more. When I started my PhD, I was the only one in my lab working on reinforcement learning. Of course, Sam, that is his main field, is reward learning, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, he knows the odd thing about reinforcement learning, decision making.
Yeah, he's heard of it.
So I think as a general point, I think you can probably wrap this up in like 20 minutes or something at most. But I'd like to kind of, before we end it, just to speak a bit about like kind of what's next for Jesse, other than sitting in a pandemic and trying to finish your PhD thesis, assuming that actually happens at some point. Yeah, do you already know what you want to do, what you're going to do afterwards? Are there specific plans or? Yeah,
so I think just like you and probably like a lot of people, I've been finding it pretty hard recently to work, and probably even harder to make next career plans. So I'm fortunate enough to have a postdoc offer from Neil, so I can stay on for a little bit, or basically for at least a year or so. I'm taking him up on that. I'm staying in the lab for a while. I would like, sort of after a lot of sort of top-down theory type work in my PhD, I think I would like to get my hands on some actual data and doing some either high-level analysis, model fitting, this kind of stuff. And there's also a chance that I won't have finished the Kalman temporal differences paper yet before the end of my PhD, so I'll have some time to write that up as well. And then in September, I'm planning to take some time off, probably. Like, I don't know what the world's going to look like by then, but if it's possible, I'd love to take some time off traveling, trying to go rock climbing in some different places in the world. Preferably like Italy, and spend some more time in the Netherlands as well, seeing my family. After that, I think, so I need to have a good think about what I want. I really enjoy doing research, so it's quite likely that I'll be doing some kind of postdoc as well. But I haven't quite decided with whom and in what kind of field. Okay, cool. So basically finish what you're doing right now and then take some time off to think about what's going to come next. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And hopefully in a COVID-free world. I mean, by then I'm sure we'll have the next plague.
This is a nice cycle, I'm sure. I mean, like, if you think about it, we've had, if you think about since the 2000s, we've had, like, what was the bird flu or whatever? I think, did we have swine flu then? We had Zika, we had Ebola, and now COVID. So it's roughly every 5 years, there's, like, another thing that most of them, I guess, didn't actually become global pandemics, but so, we're like, I guess, 4 years away from the next one. So you should have a year or two in between without a pandemic.
Hopefully. Yeah.